Good afternoon to everybody joining us today for December's Tech Talks. So today we're going to be looking at on-site water penetration testing. It appears that it's a pretty hot topic. It looks like we have quite a number of attendees across the country, so that's great, but it really lends itself to how hot this item is. You know, many manufacturers that supply fenestration products into new or renovation single-family homes may never have experienced the on-site water penetration test. Those that have become involved in projects that require site testing, they often believe that if their product passed in a lab water test, they shouldn't have any issues. I can tell you that early on in my career, I learned really quickly the impact of mullion connections when it comes to water testing that I wasn't aware of prior to getting into projects that did on-site water testing. On-site water testing brings many new challenges to the water penetration performance that might just surprise you. So hopefully today we can shed a little bit of light on the challenges faced and what suppliers should look for. So I'd like to welcome my guest for today. We've got Anton Van Dyke from Centra Windows here in BC, Elie Alkhoury from CanBest Testing Laboratories in Ontario, Dave Goldsmith, PlyGem Canada in Alberta, and Zen Leo from Silex Windows in Manitoba. So we always like to know who it is that we're talking with. So I'm just going to ask each of you guys to tell us a little bit about your company and what you do for them, just really quickly. So Anton.
Sorry, Anton Van Dyke. I am the VP of Sales and Business Development. I focus a lot of my time on bid compliance, project acceptance, and what we can and can't do. I also have an extensive background as a building envelope consultant, doing a lot of leaky condos here in BC, and a history of doing a lot of water testing myself.
Lots of experience here. Elie?
Yes, Elie Alkhoury, CanBest Testing Labs. I've started the company in 1985, so that tells you a little bit about my age. We've been running a lab, an ISO 17025 accredited lab from almost day one. We do a lot of lab testing like NAFs and the like, and also a lot of field testing, air, water, and sometimes deflection and structural, depends on what's involved. So I think we've seen it all, more or less, the past 30, 35 years. So I think I'm qualified to talk a little bit about it. Thank you.
It sounds like it. Dave.
Dave Goldsmith, PlyGem Canada, Senior Code and Compliance Engineer. I've been with them for 30 years, dating back to when we were Gino. And so I'm very involved in all the technical aspects. And I'm involved in our day-to-day operations and that type of stuff. So, and also I volunteer at Fenestration Canada, where I co-chair their technical services committee. So yeah, I get into all of this stuff.
We appreciate your time, Dave. And Zhen.
My name is Zen Leo. I'm from Winnipeg, Manitoba. I'm the owner of Silex fiberglass windows and doors. We're a window and door manufacturer and focused on mainly commercial market. And we deal a lot with commercial testing and field testing.
Great, thank you very much. So we're going to ask our attendees to save their questions to the end. We'll make sure we save a few minutes to answer or address any points, questions people have. So, you know, when it comes to on-site testing, you know, what standards is it that we need to be looking for that cover on-site testing? Are they nationally accepted, or are they North America wide? I know that there's some ASTM standards and AMA standards. Wondering about, is there specific Canadian standards that overlook and oversee on-site water testing? So maybe Elie, let's start with you. You probably got a good handle on that question, I would think.
Right, yeah, the majority of specs we see reference the ASTM 1105. That's a majority of it. Sometimes they reference the 501.2 and also the field check. It's 501.3, I believe. So yeah, it's always ASTM 1105, but the performance criteria we use and they reference, talking about specifiers, will be the NAF standard or the A440 standard. So sometimes they ask for A3, B3 or whatever, okay?
Oh.
Or we go with the NAF standard to get the performance criteria. However, the procedure has always been the same, ASTM 1105, which is almost identical to the other with the ALMA test.
Okay, so we don't actually have a Canadian standard that is comparable to that. It's always using the ASTM standard. That's the guiding standard for on-site testing. Anton, you were mentioning earlier that you've done a lot of testing on both sides of the border. Do you see sort of any differences in how that's applied on either side of the border?
Yeah, I would say that's where it's sort of night and day a little bit. In BC here, and it might be different across the country, but with the leaky condos that we've had, there's a heightened awareness about product performance. So there tends to be a focus on very specific criteria and no wiggle room in regards to expectations. There's an AMA standard, a voluntary spec standard in the States. I forget the number, but if you probably just Googled AMA voluntary window specs, the US, and it's very widely adopted and accepted almost as a given in the US in specs. And what that AMA standard allows you to do is test in the field to 2/3 of the lab pressure. So they're acknowledging the fact that there's installation or on-site variables that impact product performance that goes into it. So that's something that we haven't adopted in Canada or accepted, and at least in BC, because of the heightened awareness of water penetration into buildings. It tends to be, let's establish 330 pascals and let's test that in the lab and let's test it in the field, and the product that's perfect in the lab should be perfect in the field and we should get the same outcome. That is the expectation in BC right now as it stands.
Yes. When you mentioned that earlier, I did a quick dig on it. It's section 5.3.2 in AMA 502. Dave, do you know, like, is that all about trying to address differences in the lab and in the field, going to a 2/3 water pressure? Or
yes, that's the reason for it, because of all the variabilities, and also because in the US they don't have the Canadian supplement to guide them as to what the actual performance requirements for the building is. And so they might have a strong tendency to test the product to the laboratory tested performance. And let's say you got a result of 540 pascals in the lab, you're in a location that really only needs 220 or something like that. Why should you be testing to that? So that helps with the problem in Canada, that we're not always just looking at the lab test result and trying to duplicate that. But it is, we have pointed out to our customers the language in that standard that says this is why they do it. But that tends to be taken as excuse mongering, and of course it's not, and it's, their comeback will be, well, we're testing at less than 2/3 of your laboratory tested pressure because we're only testing at 330 and you got 7 something on your casement or whatever, you know. So you can't really try to use that in a legalistic way.
So that's really interesting that's where that comes from. So Zhen, you do quite a few projects, it sounds like, where you get into this. When you're looking at, you know, bidding on or getting involved with a new project, you know, what are you looking at when you're going through the specifications, and if there's site water testing, penetration testing required? You know, is it simply, well, I look at where the building is and this is the performance I need to meet, or are you running into a situation where that specification is either potentially below that requirement or oftentimes maybe higher than that requirement? And how do you deal with that if those performance requirements maybe aren't realistic to the location of the building?
I think we used to have this issue a few years ago, and they specified, let's say our window tested to A3B5C, A3B5C5, and they specified that way. But recently we've been seeing the architect engineers, they've been educated. They are actually looking at Fenestration's website. They're looking at the location of the building. They're using the standard, the recommendations from Fenestration Canada. So we see that problem less and less.
Okay, great. Anton, I know BC oftentimes runs on its own, its own thought and process. Do you guys see that now where specifiers are looking at A440 S1 for the environmental data, or are you seeing specs that are well beyond what that requirement would be?
It depends on the client. It really comes down to specification writing. If it's a long-term holder, such as a government agency, there was a trend, where we're at today versus where we were a decade ago. The trend a decade ago was because of the heightened awareness of leaky condos, there was an overreaction to, back in the CSA days, when if the building only required a B3, there was a lot of people that said, well, let's do a B5. And that probably, limited their window suppliers for their projects. And that was their decision that they made. Over the last decade, that's come down, where a lot of people have really focused on specifying, the minimum criteria here. Even if the climatic data dictated like a 220 or 260, you're seeing 330 as the minimum threshold here in BC. No one really goes, that's for multifamily, by the way, not for single family homes.
Yeah.
So we've kind of capped that, but we will see trends, for example, and I don't know why this is, but they'll say like, well, for patio doors, we'll tolerate a 330 Pascal rating, but for the windows, we want 510. No rhyme or reason. I think they realize patio doors kind of struggle to go beyond 330, and then they specify casement. So there's a bit of a choice they make, and that's the choice they make to specify that. And that's going to start to limit their suppliers for their projects who are willing or not willing to sell product onto those projects. So I would say 10 years ago, it was 50-50 that way. Now it's about 10% in that category. So there's less of that. And when NAFs came into play, it really got more specific as to how people and how architects and spec writers determine what's appropriate for the project. So, but nothing less than 330, maybe 290 on the odd project, but that's kind of where it caps at.
Yeah, Dave, you were obviously nodding there, and I know that you've come across this a number of times. How does a manufacturer, work with a specifier on maybe pinning down realistic performance requirements, or are you running into specifiers that are saying, we don't care if you don't think you can make it, don't bid, or is there some back and forth to get specifiers to maybe look at more realistic values based on environmental data?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a problematic specification that has been written by BC Housing, and it ties the water resistance performance to the number of stories in the building, and we'll ask for up to, I think, whatever, 510 or 540 for all the products in the building. And then some people, because it's a BC Housing is involved, that's going to be the spec, or they're just looking to BC Housing as a respected spec writer, and they borrow their approach. So you wind up with these situations where you're in CAM-loops, and the Canadian Supplement and Fenestration Canada online performance grade calculator says you need a 180 because the building went over the 4 stories. They're asking for 5 something, and so we have dealers out there who just say they'd walk away from it and they don't bid because they think it's going to be too much of a hassle, right? But if you're at the point where you can have a talk with the specifier, you can point out that this is a higher than specification than is required for the project, and you can say, and looking at your elevations, your patio doors all have large overhangs, and good luck trying to find that 540 Pascal sliding patio door. Come back to us when you're ready to change your specification.
And can I add a layer of complexity to this that I think a lot of people forget about, is that when you specify that rating for field testing, you're specifying that to the installation of the product too. So what a lot of people think, and a lot of our clients and general contractors and developers think, is that, oh, this is the responsibility of the window manufacturer to be in compliance. So I have an actual project right now where the product's passing, but the installation of the waterproofing to the window is the failure point.
Yeah, I'm going to talk a bit more about install in just a bit, but you're bang on it, and that's obviously a hot topic. Dave, talking about these specs and guys asking for 510 or 540 on a 180 environmental performance requirement. our specifiers and building project, managers and GCs, do they not understand that these specifications may often drive the budget for that, the fenestration portion of the build considerably higher than what's required? And is there an argument for the industry to make that, they need to pay attention to what we're telling them?
Well, I think the problem with these specifications, you get these specifications that run to 300 or 400 pages, and it's cut and paste from a specification that was first drafted more than 20 years ago, and nobody's reading the document, right? Until an engineer at the company goes to the pertinent section for the windows and says, no, really, 6 mil glazing or thicker as required to meet wind loads. Guys, somebody wrote this for a single glazed window, someday down the road, and somehow it came into your specification for a triple glazed window. So we bring this to the attention of the general contractor, that there's some bad language in the specifications, and here's what we can provide, and please feed back to the architect or person responsible that language is in there. And then we've done our due diligence. And then because sometimes somebody will come along later and say, hey, the specification says this, why didn't you do this? Like after the fact, after everything's installed, you guys provided 3 mil glass and the specs say 6 mil. It's the same. It's exactly the same thing with the required water resistance. Somebody just cut and paste it, and nobody has actually drafted the specification recently. They're just taking a historic document and copying it.
We've all seen those cut and paste specifications. Zhen, have you run into this as well, where the specification is well outside of probably what's required? And do you have you had any success, arguing that point to have a specification changed?
Recently, last few years, we run into less and less that kind of issue. Once in a while, we run into this, and we were able to educate our clients and solve this problem. I haven't seen it becoming a real issue for us recently.
Great. Okay. Well, that's a good sign. Elie, I know CanVest obviously does site water testing. What's the qualification like to be a site water tester doing E1105 testing? Is there requirements? Is there required training, accreditations? If you want to test, what do you need to do?
Well, in my books, whoever's doing any testing should be an accredited facility. And in Canada, we have the SCC, Standards Council of Canada, that governs all the accreditation in Canada, regardless whether it's a test lab or a test standard. To be a national standard, the document has to be accredited by SCC. So this is in my books. Why? Because we are accredited and would like to maintain that. There's a lot of controls when a facility is accredited. We get not easy audits, but we get grilled like almost every year. And it deals with qualification of personnel. It deals with instrumentations, the history of instrumentation, the calibration records. It's a quality management system. Actually, it's like ISO 9001 plus a technical section. So it's called ISO 17025. So it deals with the quality and the technical in parallel. So whoever is doing the test has to go through training to whatever test they want to perform. And when they come and audit us, they will actually talk to our technicians, talk to everybody to see if they're doing it right. If not, we get a list of action items.
So
now, in reality, we get everybody is doing testing. Okay, anybody with a shop vac and a manometer, liquid manometer is seems to be qualified to do a test. And we have a problem with this because of, from a business point of view. Okay? We have a problem with this because they don't go through the rigors that an accredited lab has to go through.
So a fenestration supplier to a project, what can they do to assure that there are qualified people testing their products and making them have to maybe hop through hoops that
Right.
a truly well-trained and accredited tester may not end up having to do with them?
Right.
What do they do?
Okay. Well, first thing they could ask for is the scope of accreditation. Are you accredited by any means? And it doesn't matter. Is there anyone who's watching over your shoulder to do that particular test? That's number one. In the States, we have the fenestration masters training, and they qualify the testers for field testing. In Canada, we don't have anything similar to that. However, the SCC allows us to identify the field tests versus lab tests, because field testing has additional requirements more than what the lab testing is calling for. So for any standard that deals with field testing is identified with SCC in our scope, and then they will apply these additional requirements. Now it's very easy, you can go on scc.ca, that's the website, and search for whoever you're planning or you're going to be testing with. Okay. I bet you there are only 4 or 5 outfits in Canada that we know the accredited labs, like including CAMBEST, Intertech, Element, QAI, UL in Montreal and in Toronto. These are the accredited labs.
Okay,
Other than that,
so there's a program, there's a Standards Council of Canada that oversees all of this. Anton, walk us through the real world.
So I graduated from BCIT in the late 90s, went to work for an envelope consulting firm, part of P-Enges and working with people. And we did water testing in diagnosing leaky condos. And I was trained by somebody, by a person. No schooling. You didn't learn how to do it at BCIT. You didn't learn it from any professional organization. You learned it from a guy who'd been doing it for, I don't know, how long were they doing window testing mid-90s.
No.
And then we hired more people, and I trained the new people. And then they trained the new people, and then they trained the new people. And then I left that industry and I went into the window manufacturing industry. And then I started observing all the other people doing testing. And when you're a testing agency and when you've been trained by somebody, a mentor, you think you know what you're doing. But there's no regulatory, there's no back checks, there's no, let's take a test. Yeah. Like in the roofing sector, I became a registered roof observer, and I went to school and took a test and have to get, learning credits and to keep that license. And now I witness people doing testing, and I'm like, the example I like to say it is I'll go to watch a test and I'll watch them set up. I won't say anything. I'll watch every step. And just before they test, I say, hey, where's your checklist? I don't have one. What pressure PSI is going to be at the rain rack when you turn it on? And one guy one time said, oh, the gauge is broken. Let me go get another one. And so you end up in this situation where you kind of, when you look at the world of testing and accredited labs and the level of professionalism that exists in our industry, in engineering, in architecture, in labs, and then you get water testing. And it's like, and I remember when I started doing work in Seattle, in 2005 or 2006, they passed legislation that required basically on condominium projects, water testing on all projects because they were running into their own leaky condo problem too. And I remember a guy approaching me. He's like, yeah, I'm just going to get a truck, build a rain rack, and I'm going to become a window testing company. That is literally how they can start up. So it's an interesting thing when you look at NFRC and U values and certification. you need to be an accredited lab in order to get legitimate reports. We're asked to have we have a full-on test booth in our facility. We could write our own reports and do our own testing and produce it, but no architect or anybody would accept that. They want third-party test reports, accredited test reports. So why is it okay for people to just be able to be trained up and go out and do testing? And I would 100% accept it the way it is if there was a level of consistency that we saw, but we don't see the consistency. So there's a fundamental problem there with the lack of consistency that goes into it. So that's the state of where we're at right now today.
So Dave, here we have a program readily available. Standards Council of Canada accredits labs, accredits testing agencies, if you like. Why doesn't a window manufacturer just simply put that in their agreement? All water testing needs to be performed by an accredited testing agency. Am I just so naive that that's unrealistic?
Well, certainly we would like to see that, but we're going to have to put a lot of pressure on the various actors. I mean, our customer tends to be the general contractor or a dealer selling to the general contractor, and so they've got their business methods, and they're trying to spend as little as possible on the engineering components for the building to try and keep prices down. But what they really don't realize, I think, is when they have windows that are allegedly failing water tests in a project that gets hung up, because the situation needs to be resolved, just how much money is pouring out the door when they do that. And, projects have come to a screeching halt because a particular window was alleged to have a minor glazing leak that may or may not have been a glazing leak. And now instead of testing 3 windows, they want to remediate all the windows in the building and then test 10 windows to prove, that the problem is fixed. This is a huge hassle for everybody, and it can bring the project to a close. It costs a lot of money. So somehow we have to convince them that, paying a little bit more up front will get them a better result in the end.
Elie, I want to talk a little bit about...
if I may add to this, Terry, window manufacturers they'll shy away from hiring an accredited lab. We're going through a project now, a major project in the Toronto area with a major contractor. We fail the doors all the time. Sliding doors have been failing the water test. So the manufacturer says, no, we don't like what's going on. We're gonna bring in our own company, our own third-party company, which was an engineering firm, not an accredited lab. And sure enough, for whatever and however reasons, they're passing. The contractor, the GC, didn't have much of a say on this, saying, oh, okay, now we got a third-party testing passing the doors, and we're not going to hold up the project. So even though the contractor specified or requested that an accredited lab does the testing, now it comes to a point where the manufacturer got fed up with all these failures and they're blaming it on the lab. Okay, and sure enough, we were pushed away. Okay, so the engineering firm can continue with testing and issue their reports. That's the way it is. That's reality.
So yeah, I can certainly appreciate there are cases where the product is the problem. I think that's probably fair to say. Being accredited, we talked a little bit about in some of our earlier communications about calibration of equipment. And you sent me an interesting one about the spray rack calibration. Can you maybe just elaborate on what that was? And I think it surprised me a bit. So I'm going to guess that some others probably don't really understand the spray rack calibration in particular.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's related to the example I just mentioned. that the doors were failing. Okay. Well, one of the witnesses or something like that noticed that the pressure on the spray rack was 30 psi. However, when we produced the calibration certificate, it was done at 27 psi. So 3 psi difference is, oh, there we go, we got you. Your test is invalid, our door is perfect. So let's go, okay. So I said, you know, just in response to that, and just to satisfy my own curiosity, I want to see what's the dependence of spray rack pressure on the overall performance, and how does it meet the 1105 standard. The 1105 does not specify a maximum water flow. It specifies a minimum of 5 US gallons per hour per square foot. That's a minimum. However, I don't know if all of us have seen the attachments. In there is a requirement when we do calibration. It's a requirement that each compartment has to be within a certain range, and that range is pretty flexible. Okay. So when we said, okay, let's do the minimum and the maximum pressure that keep us within this range. So we find that, a spray rack of 22 psi versus 36 psi will satisfy this requirement, and we've shown it to satisfy this requirement. So that was in defense for whatever that manufacturer is saying is a 3 psi increase. Does it fail the door? I told him no, because here we go you can go as high as 36 psi, still satisfy the standard requirement, and the door should not fail because of this.
Any opposition to that from you guys?
Well,
Yeah.
I just want to say that, the amount of water, that 5 gallons per hour per square foot, is already a huge amount. I mean, if you calculate the maximum hourly rainfall of any place on Earth, in inches per hour, it's higher than that. So it wasn't designed to replicate actual conditions. It was designed to uniformly wet the surface of the window, to really, really soak it, unlike anything it would ever get in the real world. So it's already not a real world test. But I think, when we talk about the calibration of the spray rack, keeping that in mind, that is the least of our problems out there. The problems that we're seeing is a complete lack of professionalism on the part of the testing agencies. And we have many examples. I can start with one where I had to go to a job in Kelowna where I agreed to meet the guy at 9 o'clock. As I had to fly in from Calgary, and they were just going to test one window, and it was a picture over an awning window. And by the time I got there, he was on the final minute of his 4th cycle. And I said, "How are we doing?" And he says, "It looks like we're doing okay." And then the test was finished, and he says, "Okay, let's see if we got any water in there." He cuts the poly. He looks. There's a single drop of water on the glazing tower of the sash. He says, "Oh, that must be a glazing failure. You're going to have to come back and remediate the glazing in all these units in this building. And then we can do some more tests, right? Like at least 3 more tests, right?" And I said, "Wait a minute. I flew out here from Calgary to watch the whole thing from the beginning to end. And you can't just walk away now. We got to reset up here and see what we're doing." And to start with, I opened the window, undid the sash limiting device, and observed that the weather stripping was covered in crap from the construction phase. And it was causing a discontinuity in the seal at the head of the sash that was allowing water to build up, and it would drip down from the head of the sash. And he mistook that for a glazing leak. Cleaned the weather stripping, closed and locked the window, it passed with flying colors. But if nobody had been there from our end, we would have got one of these typical reports that just says, "I tested the window and it failed. Get your service people out here and correct this." And so now this is pre-COVID. And so we used to have a full-time guy in BC running around observing these tests. He no longer works with us. And if he was not available, if he was double booked, we would have an engineer fly out from Calgary, either me or one of my colleagues, and observe the testing. Okay, so post-COVID, that's not going to be the case anymore, I'm going to tell you. And we need to talk about how we're going to deal with the fights, the absolute cat fights that are going to occur now when these guys send us test reports that say nothing except we found a leak, go fix it, and we'll do some more testing. And how we're going to say, that's not a valid report. You did not diagnose in any way the leak. You didn't open the window, you didn't clean it, you just walked up to it, set up a spray rack, polyed off the inside and got going, right? And we've seen even more egregious things where it's the installation, it's not the window. They blame everything on the window, and so forth and so on. So, you know, that 5 gallons per hour per square foot, I don't care if it's 6 gallons per hour or 4 gallons per hour. It's not the core of our problem here.
Other issues, yeah. Okay.
Could I just build on that for in regards to the calibration side, and they're related to both topics, because Dave sort of took it into a bit of a different direction there. But you know, what is when I look at window manufacturing and testing versus construction and testing, right? And I think that's what we miss. We miss this, what we as window manufacturers use testing for versus what the field testing uses testing for. And so this is related to Dave's topic, but also to this calibration. If testing in the field is done to different parameters than the lab, I'm sorry, but I have no comment anymore. We're done. Contractually, we're done. And so I had a situation where they were using uncalibrated rain racks. And when I asked for the report, number one, they got offended. How dare you ask for the report? Number two, they said, you're not my client. I don't have to give it to you. And we can test with whatever we want. And I'm like, well, then I'm considering it invalid and we're done with the project and we're going to walk away. That's how I threatened back to basically force them. So I got the report. And guess what the report told me? They were using uncalibrated rain racks. The report also told me that the rain rack was calibrated at 18 inches away and they were testing at 6 inches away because they were Juliet doors and the railing was 6 inches away, and it was easy for them to strap it to the railing than to try to build a rigging that would make it 18 inches away. So we had that one issue. But the other part is what you talked about, Dave, there seems to be this assumption that the results we get in the lab are the same results we would get in the field, and they're not. Field issues bring in way more complexity. And so the level of understanding of how to test product on a construction site versus in the lab, and I've even seen accredited labs send people to do field testing that they don't understand the complexity of construction sites where the product is not installed perfect. The product is out of square. The product does have a bow in it because framers are installing windows. And so there's this element of bringing it back to what we know, lab testing results. Field testing is designed to replicate lab results. And if they're not done the same with the product being the same, we will not get the same result. And that is probably the single biggest missing component of relating lab testing to field testing, in my opinion. So
yeah, totally agree. Zhen, I'm going to bet that you're running into this all the time where you get perfectly acceptable high performance results in the lab, and yet you go out with the same product into the field and run into, you know, many of these scenarios that Dave and Anton are referring to. You know, what's your experience and how have you dealt with that where perfectly acceptable product in the lab is failing in the field for whatever the reasons are?
I think the calibration of the equipment is just one area of this issue. We're seeing inconsistency of the testing performance and how they practice the test. I can say sometimes if we fail with this testing agent, if we hire different testing agent, we can pass. I'll give you an example. We're getting a testing report saying we failed the smoke test. And another testing agent saying, there's no way you failed a smoke test. You can't say, technically, you cannot say you failed smoke test.
How can you fail a smoke test? It's unquantifiable. And windows are allowed to leak a certain amount of air leakage through the NAFS A3.
What constitutes a smoke test failure? Yeah.
That shows you
that's
right
a common one. That's a common one we've seen. I just give you an example of inconsistency. And sometimes we run into let's say last job, the most recent job, the testing agent failed us on air test. And I know our window is built very tight. Our window only 10% of was A3 allowed? There's no way I failed air test. So I didn't do anything. And later on, the GC called me, is asking, did you guys do any remedial work? I said, I haven't done that. He said, you should do remedial work. And by the way, they retest the window, they passed. I tell you good news. I didn't do any remedial work. They test the same window, same people, same equipment. I passed the test the second time. I think the problem here is not only, the problem here is it's not only testing agent, and sometimes they don't have a standard to follow. Like we are talking about AMA 502 here, but I look at the specs book in Manitoba, Northwestern Ontario. I haven't seen a single architect or engineer they put AMA 502 in their specs. If we, let's say if they put in the specs, I haven't seen any testing agent actually practice 502. I just give you an example. 502 asking exterior wall and cladding, brick facade has to be finished prior to window testing, or the finishing caulking has to be done before you test the window. I haven't seen any single testing agent.
Yeah.
I just want to build, we're going to do another topic on air leakage testing, because I had a developer actually tell me it wasn't our windows. They tested a whole building for air leakage, and they said the windows caused the building to fail. And I said, well, how do you know? And he goes, well, I put my hand up against it and it was drafty. And I said, you know, windows are allowed to leak a certain amount of air through the NAFS testing. And he goes, well, the NAFS requirements are not good enough anymore for our buildings.
Oh boy.
That's literally the position they're taking. And I'm kind of going, well, what do we do?
So I want to talk a little bit about installation, and you referred to it earlier. First off, you know, I have a real issue with in-lab testing installation practices and what happens in the real world. And I would go so far as to say that the majority of the product I've seen tested in the lab is not at all installed like that out in the field. So I don't think that those values, you know what, I'm not going to go there. Testing in the field, installation practices, not the same as what the lab installation detail is. How do you deal with that, Anton? Like,
so there's two things, and this is what I think people mistake with window testing, is there's two definitions of installation testing. There's product testing and product performance, and then there's installation testing and installation performance. Within the installation component, though, it will impact the product performance. So for example, if let's take a horizontal sliding window or a patio door, and let's say it's a 1/2 inch out of square as it's installed. So when you close the patio door to almost close and you make it tight on one corner, it likes to open up on the top, right? So you get a 1/2 inch gap on the top and it's tight on the bottom. Well, when that door closes and seats, is the weather stripping fully in contact as it was intended to be? No, no. So will that window perform as it was intended to perform, and will it perform the same as it did in the lab? No, it won't. Is that an installation error? Or is that so now if the window fails, did the product fail? Or did it fail due to improper installation? How does the accredited lab or testing agency write that report? Because right now they write the report with a product failure. Now, if we attend and we're invited and we ask for 5 days notice, some ask for 7 days notice. If we attend before the test, we actually will check for plumb level square. And we'll say, this window is not permitted for testing. We cannot approve this window for testing. The testing agency will say, well, per my contract, I am obligated to test the window as it is installed, whether it was installed correctly or not. So now field testing becomes the responsibility of a vast group of people. The general contractor who's overseeing quality control. Guess who's paying our bill, by the way? Guess who has the motivated stick to ensure that things go a certain way? Now you start running into a level of really muddy situations. And so most people assume an installation test of a product is the building envelope installation, but it's testing the quality of the product installation as well. We had a situation where we had a horizontal slider and it wasn't shimmed correctly. So there was a bow.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And it was at its max. Like they actually wanted to push for 400 Pascal water rating on a slider, which we've been able to do. but man, that window's got to be perfect, like perfect. Because
Yeah.
remember, the drainage is on either side. There's a bow. What
Yeah.
happens to the water?
Yep, seen
Right.
that too many times.
And so we're not invited to the test. We get the report forward to us saying your window failed, the sill overflowed. And we go there and put a level on it, and there's a good 3/8 of a bow. And we say, well, the sill's not level. And the general contractor goes, well, fix it. Well, that's what we're what do we do? And so it's really important that we understand what the definition of installation is about. And I'm trying to tell testing agencies that if you see a product that's installed incorrectly, don't test it. What's the point? What's the purpose? If you don't have cladding on, like you talked about, or caulking, or the interior finishes on, why test it? What's the point? Literally, like, what are we doing and why are we doing what we're doing? I wrote a note here as we started. What is the purpose of field testing? What are we trying to achieve? What are we trying to create?
Well, they've completely lost sight of that, Anton. I mean, it's because of the leaky condo issue, right?
Yeah,
And
so
it's to protect the building, it's to protect the building owner from not having a multi-billion-dollar leaky condo issue. And they're not even, in many cases, not even looking at the installation from an integration into the building envelope. And then when they see a window fail, it's the type of failure that would not cause a building envelope issue. You know, like a very minor glazing leak, right? That at the end of the fourth cycle, you know, one single drop of water runs down the pane of the glass from the head, right? That can't conceivably cause a building envelope failure, but that's what they're fixated on. So they have lost sight of the purpose of their testing, and it's to ensure that the installation is not going to cause a massive hidden leak that's going to make it into the building envelope and start rotting that envelope. And they have completely lost sight of that.
So Dave, how are
Let
you guys?
let me respond to Anton, if you like, and Dave. Okay. Anton brought up this issue of whose responsibility to have the window tested or not. We get a request to test few windows at random to start with. And then we assume we have what we call test readiness. And in that, obviously the onus is on the manufacturer or the contractor to say, hey guys, yeah, we're ready to test. Everything is caulked on the outside, everything is ready to go ahead. Okay, we checked all our windows, they're all plumb and level and not bowing or whatever. So that's why they ask to test at random. And we follow instructions. The consultant says, okay, I'm going to test this, and that window. Okay. If the manufacturer says, well, the windows are not ready for testing, let's test these. So we know, I mean, the consultant is going to say, obviously you're not ready for testing. So we'll come back whenever you're ready. So that's very, I mean, it's not our choice really to clean a window or to test the weather strip or the stash limiting device, eating on the weather strip and all this. No, it's that your product is going to be tested on site. So let's go there and check them, make sure the test lab is ready to go ahead. And there's no way you can blame the test lab
Elie,
if the drainage holes are blocked.
you're asking for a massive amount of manufacturer support on site, and who's going to pay for that?
But I think the point is that Elie, you say the manufacturer is there, and I think we've all experienced this where you get a phone call from the GC saying your windows failed, and we're like, what are you talking about? Like, you didn't even tell us there was a test. So first point is that the manufacturer needs to be there prior to a test, and if they determine that there's some poor install conditions that are going to impact their performance of the product, they should be within their rights to say either that gets remediated by the installer or we test something else that they deem to be appropriately installed. It's a great topic, and we could probably go on for hours on that. but there are some questions. So I want to make sure that we get those in before we go. So Steph, you have some questions there?
Yeah, we have a lot of comments in the chat and the Q&A. So I don't know, like, do you want me to go through?
Let me see if I can, hang on, I got other things popping up here. Let me just have a look here. Okay, so Sudhir says, what if on-site testing is done by unaccredited personnel with the art of technology from the 50s vacuum and see a few water droplets on glazing stops? How much as a window manufacturer should we take it seriously? Now they want us to do remediations. Can we walk away if it's not accredited lab? Does this test stand any chance if it goes to court? Anton, I know you'd love to answer that.
Yeah, we used to, in the leaky condo days, mid 90s, late 90s, we used to do a lot of water testing of windows that would be like 10 years old, 5 years old. And we tested to the full like B3 rating back then, and that was used in court all the time. You know, so there is probably case law. I'm not a legal expert, so don't quote me on anything, but there probably is a lot of case law about how testing is used, whether it's considered, you know, you could question in courts, you can always question the integrity of the company that's dictating the result from the test. So there's probably some options there. The walk away part's interesting because, and this is where the conflict really lies, is the general contractor or developer is paying our bill. They're also the one coordinating the training. They're also the one responsible for the on-site installation quality control. They're also the one who's hired the testing agency. They're also the one responsible for cleaning and preparing the product and removing construction debris prior to the test. It's one thing to walk away and go to court or defend, but the reality is you're spending more time trying to collect compensation for the work that you did than anything else. And this is where I think the level of unprofessionalism really comes into play. Is, you know, somebody can write a report and there's no consequences of a report that's missing a lot of observations and technical criteria that it should contain. And then someone's using that report to make a decision on what to do. So yeah, someone could use that report to go to court. Like, so just to play out a scenario, they don't pay us, we put a lien on, it goes to court. Now the testing reports become documents that go into that to negotiate compensation. That's probably where you're going to see those things play out more and more. But I would say most don't end up getting to that point. You end up just settling because the money goes into trust and you settle a payment. And it's frustrating because I've seen buildings get to the point where everybody like throws their hands up because number one, calibration reports were faulty in the testing. So everyone kind of like starts pointing their fingers and does this and this and this. And they go to the contractual obligation and they'll pull out the specs. And the problem is the spec is written for the supply and install of the windows. So we're responsible for like a part of the spec because we're the material part of the spec, but the GC is part of the execution part of the spec. So no one knows contractually who's responsible for what anymore. And you end up in this muddy, muddy mess of how to resolve the issue. And the issue all stems from a test report that came out that did not clearly define the failure.
Indeed. Okay, specs. David says, when you have an engineering firm cut and paste their specs into a package and most spec requirements don't fit the project, additionally, that firm is doing the testing with a vacuum cleaner on assemblies and not individually rated units. How's a manufacturer to respond to failure results? Smoke tests also utilized, which cannot be quantified. Yeah, I think we've definitely addressed those. Kyle says here, excellent discussion. I believe the copy and paste issue of project specifications specifically for multifamily is problematic to say the least. Indeed. At times we've provided two pricing options, one that meets the building code minimum requirements and one that meets the specs. That's interesting. Vast majority of the time for the price difference could be 30%, 40% higher. Should GCs and or developers owners not require the spec writer to properly justify the price difference, not to mention the potential of wasted material, glass, steel, labor? One manufacturer may bid to the spec and one may bid to the code minimum, certainly not fair bidding opportunity. So we've spoken about training window installers, building envelope specialists and framers. What about training specification writers as well?
Yeah,
Dave? Yeah, Dave, there's a new career for you.
Oh God, we're not even sure who the spec writer is, right? somebody was a spec writer in many cases 10 or 20 years down the road, and then someone else has been cutting and pasting these specs in. And without regards to changes in standards, you see quite a lot of A3, B3, C3 still, even though we've been in NAVs for, almost a decade now, and so we just need to, all we can do is bring it to the attention of the GC that these specs are wacky, and we're not quoting these specs, we're quoting a reasonable spec. Yeah. And you need to bring it to the attention of whoever is responsible for these specs, for overseeing them, and I believe that in most cases is the architect. And you need to say, listen, the company who's supplying the windows has brought this to our attention. Do you want to act on it, yes or no? And typically they don't act on it. They accept what you have quoted. And off they go. And very, very occasionally somebody comes along later after the whole project's over and said, dude, the spec was 6 millimeter and you provided only 3 millimeters. And like they're trying to get some money out of you or something. You say, yeah, right.
Okay, I want to keep going because we're almost out of time. So David says, test the window or test the opening, 2 different scenarios. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I just don't know that, I don't know how we would be able to ever get that enforced or get people to buy in.
But there's a third one to add to this. There's testing the window in the different scenario, like in the opening.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep, indeed. Robert says, just as an info, others cite like International Accreditation Services and National Voluntary Lab Accreditation Program needs to be checked for ISO 17025 accredited lab, as there is a world agreement on reciprocal accreditation programs. As a fact, at UL, both Varennes and Toronto are accredited under ISO 17025 and IAS. So there are alternative accreditation options. It sounds like what he's trying to say there. So David says the quote you give for the job should contain the labor to prepare a unit prior to testing. Interesting. I think that mock-up testing is a good idea, and maybe that's somewhere where we need to go, where you do an initial mock-up and a test to qualify that building's product performance. Maybe that's the way to go. Murray says accredited labs raise the bar for sure. However, accredited labs are not governed for their understanding of evolving fenestration installation practices arising from dramatic changes in enclosure systems. When we get into net zero and beyond, absolutely, we're seeing wall details that are changing almost daily. As much as field testing may benefit from accreditation, perhaps these accredited field testing services should require building enclosure accreditations. Can't argue with you there, Murray. Okay, there's a question. Rocco says, we add a label on our product with a disclaimer. Disclaimer emphasizes that product must be installed in accordance to the installation standards set out in A440.4. As well as following our own installation guidelines. In addition, we request that the door not be tested unless the door has been serviced, inspected, and cleaned. The fact is, this should be the standard across the industry. How can we ensure that all engineers, consultants follow these practices and requirements? Could not agree more. Anton, go ahead.
Yeah, just commenting on that, because I deal with this one all the time, and the position, especially like consulting firms that are doing testing, their position on this is contradictory to that statement right there. They say we're hired by our customer to verify installed product regardless of the condition. So if we see construction debris in it, we will not clean it, we'll test it as is. If we see the weather stripping is torn or damaged because they ran air hoses through the windows, we don't care, we're gonna test it as it is. We're testing assuming no one is gonna service the product. That is their position. So there's a fundamental gap in these aspects of what we're doing on that note. So you can write those disclaimers all you want, but they're in a position to do something completely different. So
yeah, totally. Bradford mentions that Fenestration Master certification also applies in Canada. Thank you. Steve says, our side hinge doors field tested for water. See it all the time. All the time. Yep.
I think I warned everybody a while ago. This is hot in BC right now.
Yeah.
Be careful if you're selling single point hardware with single weather stripping in BC. You're going to be in a world of hurt. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, doors are very difficult to have pass. I mean, they might even have surface roughness around the edges, and you test them in the lab, and pisses
Yeah.
through, and you open the door, you have to sand the 3 edges to
Yeah,
get a good
artificial
seal.
grain. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Bradford says in the chat here, AMA 511 outlines a prescriptive procedure for proper forensic evaluation for proper fenestration. For evaluating water penetration. AMA 511, folks, give that a read. That sounds like it's got some interesting information for us. Emmanuel says the FenCan calculator is based on Canadian NAF supplement. It's just a tool. Recommendations are minimum in the supplement are based on the actual most recent environmental data across Canada. Specifiers should use it as their starting point to figure out what they need. Totally agree. Who controls the specifier for not being realistic or not? Flip a coin. AMA 511, again, is referenced. All reports must be self-contained documents. That is the factual basis for the findings and conclusions are expressed in the document. Report must include justification for deviations from the methodology described in that standard, must not include any unsubstantiated opinions or conclusions. If the results are not conclusive, the forensic investigator should prevent options for obtaining conclusive results, such as new testing protocol or procedures. So it sounds like AMA 511 has some really interesting points that we need to look at. Sarb says that GCs are responsible for the rough opening prep. Yes, they are, but oftentimes they point to the window manufacturer supplier as being responsible to figure out why a failure caused by a rough opening installation is happening. So, okay, let's see here, just trying to make sure I capture all the comments.
Sorry, Terry, if I can comment on the 511.
Yes.
The 511. Yeah, the AMA 511 standard is a forensic guide to investigate water failures. It's not for conformity testing.
Okay, thank you.
Just to make this clear.
Sure, thank you.
Right,
George says, hang on, I got to blow this up a bit. My eyes are failing me. What are the standards and parameters for air blower testing? How to differentiate and establish air tightness of a product when the full building is tested for air tightness? Anton, you're probably running into a lot of air tightness testing, I would expect.
This is the go-to right now is blame the windows, everybody. Like, this is bad. I've had several situations where the EAs, the energy advisors, after they do whole blower door testing, they're going around with smoke pencils or something and going, oh, there's air movement around the window, not realizing the A3 allowance for air leakage. Like, we're allowed 0.5 liters per meter second for air leakage. And the product we're doing is like 0.05. Like, it's so much better, but they don't know what to do because there's big holes in the air barrier. The roof to wall transition sucks. The cantilevered balcony joist penetration details, they can't quantify that leakage, but they can quantify window leakage. And so they're
leaking from the shared wall between the two suites. You know, I mean, I'm hearing a lot of chatter about that these days as well.
We probably need to have a session on this because George's comment there about equating whole building air leakage to windows and how to do that calculation, it does not exist. And people are trying to figure out how to apply this logic to it right now. And developers or general contractors want a single person to blame for why their building failed to meet the air leakage requirements that it had. So
and
that one has me actually really worried about the next 5 years, to be honest, more than water testing.
The window and door guys have all the money. That's why they're going after them, right? Some other comments here, but some of them are really long, and I see that we're already running past our time, so I'm going to have to cut off the comments at this point. Just a last thing from each of you here in our panel today, sort of just very general, you know, what do you recommend for suppliers that are getting into projects that require site testing, and try to keep it to, you know, a couple of minutes tops. Zen, recommendation.
I think my recommendation is if you look at the whole picture of this testing thing, like you guys said, doesn't matter. Sometimes we have manufacturer defects. That's true. Nobody's perfect. But most of the problem.
Oh, we're having a little bit of a connection.
Those issues has been 100% we have to address with manufacturer service costs. And also, if you look at the whole picture, we're assuming the testing agents are perfect. They're doing their job. They know what they're doing. Nobody challenged them. Which is not really true. My recommendation is number one, we should probably look at establish a Canadian testing, in-field testing standard. See what we should follow, either AMA 502 or 511, or we should have our own testing standard. Also, I was suggesting possibly we should have a discussion of possibly establish a qualification or licensing program for the testing agent.
Sounds like there's some work ahead for a Fenestration Canada task group. Anton, basic recommendations.
So I've developed, I haven't enacted it yet. Supply chain issues have kind of overcome everything to do, but I've created an additional schedule that I add to contracts now. I call it Schedule Blank. So if they have Schedule D, it becomes Schedule E, and it is a pre-window testing checklist that is going to become contractual now on any job that I do, and becomes a contractual negotiation. And what it basically does is it embraces testing. It accepts the fact that we're going to be testing. It requires us to be given 5 days notice. It requires the testing agency to submit all their calibration. It requires them to submit the CV of the person doing the testing and how many tests that they've done and who did their training. I'm kind of going about it my own way to basically instill professionalism, because there is no level of professionalism created. So doing what I know, and that's really all I can do. And if we all start doing it, then the negotiation gets a little bit easier, but that's life. So
I love it. Anton, you and I are going to talk. Dave, recommendations.
Well, understand the specs before you bid. And if they're doing field water testing, you have to ask for the notice to go out there and have somebody technical observe it, or else you're just going to get screwed every time.
Yeah.
And so I like Anton's approach, but honestly, I think with COVID and everything that has happened, I think there's been a change of heart in our management. And there's companies begging for products out there because of supply chain constraints, right? And you're able to supply product, and now they want to run you through the ringer like this. I think they're going to start walking away from projects where you're not getting treated with respect.
Yeah.
And so we got rid of our field test guy, our full-time field test guy, and we're not sending engineers out to these projects anymore. And we'll see how that goes in 2022.
Yeah. We could all use a little more respect. Elie, recommendation for window and door suppliers into water spec projects?
Yes, I've got two recommendations. First of all, be ready for testing. Really, we go on site, sometimes we cancel it. On-site cancellation is also expensive. Okay, there's no water, the window's not ready, it's not caulked here or there. So be ready for testing. Okay, we welcome witnesses, especially from the manufacturer's side, because I know if a window failed, we have to justify it, and we're open for challenges. We produce calibration reports if required and everything. That's
Right.
Recommendation number one. Number two, do not oversell the product. If you produce a report of B7 in the lab, you can get, they'll hold you to it. Even though the specs say 300 Pascal, we're gonna test at 700. Why? Because you said so.
That's an excellent
So
point.
we've
That's an
seen that
excellent
a few
point.
times.
And I've run into that in the past. So that's a great point. Thanks for raising that.
We downgraded our ratings from our test ratings.
Yeah.
We got a sliding patio door test at 400. We label it at 330.
Yeah, I think that's really smart. So we're well past our time. Obviously, a great hot topic that warrants more discussion, and we'll be doing that. So Elie, Zen, Anton, Dave, thank you so much. I really appreciate your guys' expertise and participating today. Thanks a bunch. Really, that was such a great session. This is going to be our last Tech Talks for 2021. I want to thank everybody for their participation and support this year. And please share topics of concern that you'd like us to bring up in our Tech Talk session for 2022. You can send those to Al or I anytime. Also, visit our online tech forum at fenestrationcanada.ca/forum. It's a great open forum for posing questions and discussions. So, I want to thank everybody so much. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year to everybody. Stay safe out there, and let's all just stay safe, be kind, and we'll see you next time around. Thanks a bunch, guys. Appreciate your time today. Thank you.
very much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yes.